Good evening, everyone. I think we should start.
Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for coming. My name is Fatin Al-Tamimi. I'm the chairperson of Ireland-Palestine Solidarity Campaign. We all welcome you here tonight for our event. Just before we start, I need to point out the fire exits. We have two here, one here and one there at the back one. And there is the toilets are at the very back, at the end of the corridor there. Thank you very much for all for coming tonight to this fantastic crowd, meeting these famous people, to talk about Palestine. This is one of the things Ireland-Palestine Solidarity Campaign do in this country to make the Palestinian voices heard and to advocate for Palestinians. And we're here tonight. We have very famous people who went to visit Palestine lately, and just going to tell you their first-hand what they saw in Palestine themselves there. I'm going to introduce Betty Purcell, and she is going to do introduce our guests tonight to speak with them. So Betty Purcell, she's the moderator for tonight. And she is an Irish human rights and equality commissioner, freelancer television producer, and media consultant. Previously, Betty worked as a senior television producer with RTE, and over 33 years has produced countless radio and television programs. Betty has written a book on broadcasting inside RTE and Nicaragua Light After Darkness. And Betty visited West Bank on the Arab harvesting trip, and she's going to tell us the story and introduce our guest speakers tonight and talk about their trip. Thank you very much. Would you please put your mobile on silent if you don't mind, please. Thank you very much.
We have to think of this all the time. Thanks, Fatin, and you're all very welcome here this evening. I'm not going to talk for long because I'll be part of this conversation that we'll be having as the evening goes on. But I did just want to say a few words about the trip that I went on, because we all went on very different trips. And the one I went on, which was 2 years ago, was an olive picking one. And olives are very important in the culture and mean an awful lot to Palestinians. They're very wedded to the landscape, and the olive trees are significant for that. I think that's something that we'll all have seen. The landscape of Palestine, by the way, if you do get there, is so beautiful. And the reason why we as internationalists were asked to go and pick with the farmers is that close to the settlements, it's a very dangerous place for Palestinian farmers to try to either plant olive trees or harvest their olives, because the settlers, who are many, there's 700,000 of them in the West Bank, which is a small area the size of Mayo, and they're heavily armed and very aggressive. And they come down as people are trying to harvest their olives, and they attack people, and they're very vociferous and very nasty. They also come down and uproot olive trees. At night they come and burn olive trees, and they sometimes come with the assistance of the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF, who fully back them, as if they're not armed enough. So the reason we were there was to just give some international assistance. Not that we were very good olive pickers, because we weren't, but we were good in terms of the security of the farmers, and they really appreciated it. And they talked about, we had lunch with them every day, and it was a really beautiful experience to do that. And it's one of the things that you can do if you go to visit Palestine. They talked about the importance of the trees to them and the ancientness of the trees, and some of the trees were up to 2,000 years old. And you just got a real sense of that culture and what it meant to them. That impressed me an awful lot. There were a lot of other things that I noticed when I was there, and I think that will be the subject of our conversation, because I think there are things that all of us noticed: the separate roads, the checkpoints, the water shortage for Palestinians, the poverty in the West Bank, and Gaza is even worse, where Harry was. So these are the issues that we'll be discussing as the evening goes on. So it falls to me to introduce this very wonderful panel of esteemed people. And the first person, of course, who hardly needs any introduction to anybody over the age of 30, is the legendary Mike Murphy. He said go higher. Mike is a legend of Irish broadcasting, known for programmes like The Live Mike, Winning Streak, The Arts Show, and The Big Interview. Within RTE, he was known as someone who was very nice to work with, which was not always the case with big presenter colleagues. In September this year, he visited Palestine along with his son Mark, travelling in Hebron, Bethlehem, Jerusalem, and other areas. Nelly Conroy is an actor known for her roles in Love Hate, Trial of the Century, Intermission, and The Van, as well as a lot of theatre productions. In April, she visited the Freedom Theatre in Jenin, which is based in the refugee camp in Jenin, and worked there with young Palestinian actors. She's also director of the Cultural Arts Festival, PalFest. Harry Browne is a lecturer in the School of Media at DIT, and also with the Centre for Critical Media Literacy. He's a widely published journalist and a known commentator. He's written a number of books, most recently The Front Man, Bono, in the Name of Power, very topical for the current week that's in it. He visited the Gaza Strip in January 2013 in the aftermath of the Israeli onslaught around that time, which was in November 2012. Harry. So this is going to take the shape of a conversation as much as we can, given that we've all had very different experiences, followed by questions from you in the audience, and hopefully some thoughts on where we go from here. So I wanted to start first and ask each of you, because they're all separate experiences, maybe Nelly first, about your thoughts on your first arrival in Palestine.
In Palestine or the airport?
Either. Your first thoughts.
Oh, in Palestine, you could breathe in Palestine. Getting from the airport to Palestine was it's a different story. You know, you arrive at the airport and what's your name? They have all these questions at you, and I wasn't very prepared for that. So I was like, what are you here for? And I was like, a holiday. And where are you staying? And I was going, we're staying in Jerusalem, and that was only we had a place booked for one night. And where are you going after that? And I was like, oh, well, I don't know, I'm going to see. So I wasn't really that prepared, but I got in anyway, so that was the main thing. But Palestine was fantastic. Arriving in Palestine was like, at last I've arrived. Yeah, that's how I felt.
Mike.
Do you want me to hold the microphone?
Do we have to pass this along, folks?
What do we do with it? Will we hold the microphone or what?
Yeah.
Harry, how did Bono get the money out? Did you ask him? You see, get your priorities right. I went along, I wrote an article in the Irish Times after I came back, and in the course of the article I said why I went, and it was because years ago Kader Asmal, who became a minister in the South African ANC government, said to me, this is back in the 70s, he said to me, will you get involved in the anti-apartheid movement? And I didn't bother my backside, and I felt awful about the fact that I hadn't done so, and I felt guilty about it. So I was thinking that when all this business was happening in Palestine and I was hearing about the injustices that were going on, that I felt I'd better go and have a look. I'd like to see for myself rather than be reading newspaper reports. Also, I felt with George W. and what he had done in Iraq, the emphasis on the Middle East had been taken totally away from the Israel-Palestine situation and on to other things that, as we all know, have descended into something close to hell. But anyway, so I signed on with a grouping that was being organised by Elaine Daly, who I saw arriving here tonight. And I think there were 35, 36 people in the group. We went over, we arrived in Tel Aviv late at night, got in about 1 o'clock in the morning, about that. And then these guys said, I was one of the people that went up with my papers, whatever, and they said, could you step to one side? And a number of us were taken to one side. And then they came in and I think there were about 14 or 15 of us out of the group were held to one side. And these guys came in and said, have any of you been here before? A number of people said yes. And I was one of the people who said yes. And he said, when were you here? I said, I was here for the Eurovision Song Contest. He said, when? I said, I can't remember. It was that far back. So anyway, they took my passport and the 5 others. There were 5 of us, I think it was. I can't remember exactly. And they took them to one side, and then we were all kept sitting, waiting in this holding area for, I mean, you're talking about an hour and a half, maybe more. Then they called the 6 of us, one after another, over to another corner of the airport. And then by the time I got there, I think 3 of the people had been deported, and there was a Dublin woman was being interviewed inside, behind a partition. And myself and another woman were waiting outside the partition, and we heard these guys shouting and roaring at the woman and banging the desk and all this kind of stuff. It really was, I was going to say, in the name of Jesus, at these guys at. And so anyway, it was very unpleasant. And then they came out. I think she was quite frightened, and they took her out, and then they walked past. And I said something to her as she walked past, and they said, don't speak to him, don't speak to him. And they took her off somewhere. And so then next, it was my turn was next. So when I went in, there were two guys, and there were others standing at a side door looking in, spectating some of their honchos. And I said when I went in, listen, I said, I'm going to react very badly if you start banging the table and shouting at me like that. Now, what did I mean? I think I meant I'd sulk. I certainly didn't mean I was going to launch myself across the table and hit them over in the throat with a claw hammer grip. But I kind of, so anyway, and so then they showed me a little bit of footage of, sorry, has the microphone not been close enough, has it not? Sorry about that, if not. Anyway, one of the guys took out a phone and he showed me a little bit of footage where there were some Irish people who had been at a demonstration, and they were throwing stones against the wall, and somebody had an Irish flag, and he was saying something like, throw some more fucking stones or something like that. Was unmistakably Irish, I can assure you. But anyway, they said, are you going to go to any demonstrations? No, I'm not going to do. What are you here for? I want to see for myself. See what? I want to see Palestine for myself. You don't want to see Israel? Not especially. I said, I want to see Palestine. I've seen parts of Israel. So then they said, who are these people you're with? I said, I don't know. I haven't met them before. Don't know who they are. And I said, what's the story? What about that woman that went out ahead? What has happened to her? She's been deported. What about the others? They've been deported too. And I said, what's the principle of the deportation? How do they get deported? They're brought to the departure lounge, and they'll be on the 4 o'clock plane back to, I think we came from, I can't remember, Istanbul or somewhere. Anyway, and I said, who pays for them? The airline pays, which kind of surprised me that it was the airline was going to pick up the tab. Anyway, so they said, will you be attending demonstrations? No, not intending to do so. So they said, we want to take your photo. So they took my photo, and they put me sitting in a chair, took my photo, and on a big screen they showed me the photo. And then they said, and then they fragmented the photo, so they took a little bit the eye, the ear, the chin, and kind of fragmented the photo. And they said, we just want you to know that wherever you go in the world from here on in, we'll know where you are. Oh, that's right. So they said, okay, you can go. So they gave me back my passport, and then we, the rest of us, were let through. So we went on. Very unpleasant experience, I can tell you. You know, you feel this awful aggression from these people. So you're kind of saying, "My Jesus, I'd be interested to see what's going to happen to the Palestinians if this happens to us on the way in." So sorry, I took too long, I'm sure about that. But anyway, it's you, Harry.
Oh, I'll take even longer. That was an extraordinary cinematic description, wasn't it? I'm sort of picturing Mike Murphy kung fuing his way through the interrogation room now.
Oh, they were very frightened. They were very frightened.
I'm aware that when we talk and we joke as well about our kind of arduous journeys to get into this Middle Eastern country, that there are hundreds and thousands of people in this country and others who have made far more arduous journeys to get out. And you know, we're all aware of our position here, our relatively privileged position here. But so I'll tell my story in that context. I was a kind of a late jumper aboard a trip to Gaza in January 2013. One of my comrades, Max O'Brien, is here. I joined a group that had been part of the flotillas that had attempted to travel to Gaza previously, and having had encounters with the Israelis that were at least as unpleasant and considerably more so in many cases with those authorities. On this occasion, they traveled through Egypt. We traveled through Egypt, so we flew into Cairo, got up before dawn for a 6-hour journey across the Sinai. It was during the time of the Morsi government, so we had a lot of kind of ununiformed militias escorting us across the Sinai, basically teenagers with AK-47s on the backs of pickup trucks to bring us to the Rafah crossing, and no Israelis. And in terms of the authorities, it was hard to be sure who they were on the Egyptian side. There were, again, an absence of uniforms and an absence of kind of authoritative behavior, no absence of bureaucracy, and we waited quite a long time to pass through there. Interestingly, because there had been a brief 8-day war in November of 2012, part of the settlement of that war had been to allow some Qatari building materials into Gaza. So while we waited at this dusty, sad border crossing with hundreds of Palestinians and Egyptians milling around, waiting and hoping for someone to come through from the other side or to get through themselves, these huge lorries, gleaming Mercedes trucks arrived at the border and were escorted straight through to bring much needed and far less than what was needed building supplies into Gaza at that time. We eventually got through. The Hamas officials were probably a little more accommodating than the Egyptian ones. We didn't see much of them, but there was a display at the border point of a car that had been destroyed in the November war. It had been the car that had belonged to Ahmed al-Jabari, who was the military commander of Hamas, and the car hadn't been hit at Rafah, but the car had been brought to the crossing as a kind of a welcome to Gaza display for visitors such as ourselves. We were lucky to have got through at that time and in the way that we did. It remains extremely difficult to get into Gaza, and much more so now that the Morsi government is gone from Egypt. The current Egyptian regime is less amenable, and also the tunnels, which were also in full operation in 2013 and which we considered employing when it looked very difficult for us to get through at Rafah. Those tunnels are largely closed, so that if you like, that informal economy and that system of visiting, which we might talk about a little more later on, is largely closed off. Once inside, the only thing, and I'm sure this is probably true on the West Bank as well, but the thing that you see in Gaza, apart from the beautiful sea and that sense that this could be the most gorgeous spot on earth at the southeast of the Mediterranean on the sea, is the children. just everywhere you look, children, teenage boys out on the street, but children of both sexes just everywhere playing all around and always ready to approach and to start a conversation with you, which usually goes, at least in 2013, when something like this: Barcelona or Real Madrid? And you'd have to choose, and then if they were feeling very bold, they'd say, Hamas or Fatah? Anyway, I'll leave it at that for now.
I suppose while we're on the journeying map, we might talk a little bit about the whole issue of roads, because when people talk about Israel and it being an apartheid state, I must say, and I'd read a bit before I went out, but I was not prepared for the kind of apartheid that was 2 separate sets of roads. Does anyone want to talk about that, about the set of roads?
It's quite obvious when you get through the borders. We went through at night time, as we mentioned, but then the next morning we went out looking around, and it is perfectly obvious. And you see these very streamlined roads, many of them semi-tunneled. They have kind of protective armour over them so that things can't be lobbed into the roads. But there are distinctive roads, beautiful roads. I mean, really now, you'd be terribly impressed by the roads that are utilised by the Israelis. And of course, there are 2 different number plates. The Israeli cars have orange number plates, and they're allowed to use those roads. The Palestinians have white number plates, and they're not. So the roads that the Palestinians have to utilise are pretty ugly by comparison, and they're S-bends and they're potholed and there's rubbish along the sides. They're pretty awful, but these very streamlined roads. Now, I didn't see the roads, and I know between the West Bank and Gaza, I believe the roads are sensational, because they're all Israeli roads. And there's money coming in from outside, as we all know, and as we all know from whence, to help out with these roads. But the distinction is pretty ugly when you see it. And then when you get into the settlements, in many of the settlements that we went into, the roads are guiding you into these, effectively what you would see them as a kind of Florida gated communities. That's really what some of the settlements that I saw looked like. And by comparison, where the Palestinians are living, how the roads they have to traverse, the cars they have to drive, they are pretty miserable by comparison.
I know that one of the things that you wanted to talk about, Nelly, very much was the issue of water.
Yeah.
Again, dovetailing in with what Mike said about the settlements, when we were there, we went to a settlement and they actually had an aqua park and a swimming pool. And the UN says that the Israelis have access to 8 times more water than Palestinians. So tell us how it struck you in Jenin.
Well, in Jenin, we were staying in a hostel, and so there was an English woman there as well who was very conscious about having her shower every morning, and she'd give out every morning if there wasn't water. But when you go to Palestine, you notice they're like blackbirds on the roofs. There's water tanks, they're like flocks of birds on the roofs. So the Israelis dig under the aqueducts. They own all the natural resources as well. They control all that. So the Palestinians have to buy their water every week. And it's just, they have a tank that's filled up every week and they have to pay for it. And it's just, become very conscious of water. Like, I'd be a real bath person at home. And when I came back from Palestine, I didn't have a bath for months. Because I just have quick showers. You just start to think about it much more, It's horrendous, absolutely horrendous. And the soil is arid. And we went to a village in Fakua in northeast of Jenin. And it was by the Green Belt. And the Israelis had taken about 3/4 of the village, and we stood on what was the partition, and it was barbed wire and a road that the military could go up and down. And what we were standing on was with cactuses, and the soil there was dry soil, and you looked over and it was just lush green. and olive, you know, all the villagers' olive trees were there, but the field of this lush green swaying in the wind, and here we were like, you know, well, not us, we're very lucky, but here the villagers were, all their land was taken, plus the water's gone, you know. Awful, awful.
Anyone else?
Yeah.
Harry, what was it like in Gaza, water-wise?
Yeah, I mean, the conditions in Gaza are such that, you know, that beautiful sea that I talked about earlier, you could certainly at the time forget about swimming in it, because the sewage was just terrible. There was no, and unfortunately, there were people fishing in it, and I don't like to imagine the condition of the shellfish that would have been coming out from the inshore fisheries there. We heard that there was a German company coming in to deal with the sewage because the shit had started to wash up the coast, and the Israelis were getting it on their beaches too. But I'm not sure how well that was ever dealt with. Certainly there's an ongoing crisis of both water and energy in Gaza. Again, when we were there, 8 hours a day of electricity was good going, you know. Now, we hear that and it sounds terrible, but, you know, people do survive, and it's really important to say that. The people in Gaza, like people who are under terrible conditions everywhere, do everything they can to live good, normal lives. You know, they don't sit there waiting. And in Gaza, because of the way the territory has been de-developed, it's very hard to do that. You know, a proper functioning economy is absent. Nonetheless, people get their hands on fuel, they get their hands on generators, they power up batteries during the time when the electricity is available. They're stuck to their mobile phones an awful lot of the time, and you know there is, in conditions that are unimaginably and for me imaginably, because I'm remembering them, you know, devastating and impoverished and, you know, dirty and degraded. People really do make the extraordinary best of the little that they have. You know the statistics about childhood malnourishment, about the number of people who are dependent on food handouts. You know that the Israeli policy is to leave Gaza hungry but not quite starve it to death. And that's all very real, but it's important to understand, you know, the active resistance to that of everyday life, the steadfastness of the Palestinian people.
Yeah, that's a term that's used, isn't it? Samud, meaning resistance by being there, by staying. I just wanted to ask, maybe you, Mike, about the kind of personality of the Palestinians as you saw them in their resistance by staying and refusing to go and refusing to disappear.
I mean, that is the only resistance they can have, in all honesty, because there's nothing else they can do. They're scared. They are degraded all the time. We saw the degradation of the way they are treated. They're forced to queue, people who want to get into Jerusalem to work. This queue begins at 4 a.m. I've seen people who in that queue, where they get to a certain stage, they get up to one of these kids of soldiers, these Israeli soldiers, and they get up there and they show their papers, and the kid does this, like that, with his fingers, doesn't speak Arabic, maybe, so does that like that, and the person has to go all the way back down to the end of the queue and start all over again and hope that the next soldier that they come across is going to let them get through. The degradation is shocking. I saw we were in Hebron. The people themselves, it's kind of patronizing to say they're lovely people. I mean, that's just patronizing. But the fact is, when you're there in the places we were in Bethlehem and places like that, you do not at any stage ever feel any form of threat in terms of even trying to buy stuff, souvenirs and all that kind of stuff. It's never heavy selling. There's no threat in terms of your security. You never feel that there's any risk of any pickpocketing or whatever. I'm not going to say for a moment that it never happens, but it certainly is not prevalent, and it certainly isn't obvious. But in Hebron, we were going through the gates, and I saw these young guys coming through from one side, and I held back from the rest of the group, and a couple of soldiers got them. Now these are kind of 16, 17-year-old kids, cool dudes, you know, and they got them, and they stopped them, but 3 or 4 soldiers on one side, and then there was another room with soldiers on the other side of the road, which is just on the other side of the barrier. So they said to they strip searched them, they made them take their pockets, they put their hands above their heads, the whole shebang. Really put them through the mill, and they were only kids in t-shirts, you know, there was nothing but turn around against the wall, that guy's going to come over and do a search, and now about 3 or 4 times and then they were told, go. And now I didn't understand, but I saw the indications, go to that room over there on the other side of the street. And there were a couple of soldiers in that room over there, and the 2 guys went over to the room, and as soon as they got close to the door, the soldiers closed the door. So they didn't get in, so they knocked on the door, and they couldn't get in, and they're gesturing back to the people who sent them, or the soldiers who sent them over, hey, they won't let us in. So they called them back, and they searched them again. And then they said, and the guys are saying, hey, I mean, I didn't know what they were saying, but I figured they're saying, what the hell are you talking about? The guys just walked in there, they won't open the door. And then they were sent back again to it. And it happened 3 times, and on the 3rd time, these guys inside opened the door and did another search on them. And I'm thinking, if you know, you can understand these kids saying, I get these guys being utterly humiliated like that, and then they went off, and the 2 guys, I was expecting them to be in a semi-temper and all that. They weren't, and I think, I'm not saying they accepted it, but it's a fact of life that these kids are being humiliated like that. But I think the consequences on the longer term are serious for the Israelis. They certainly will never get peace, not indeed that I think they're seeking it, but they're never going to get it, because these kids they're going to turn.
It's true actually that it's such a cauldron really of oppression really, in terms of the way in which the military occupation is so pervasive. Yeah. That I mean, that description that Mike just made of, you know, that kind of, it's not for security. And what we saw it was not for security. The searching 6-year-olds' school bags, you know, and making them tumble their little school books out onto the ground near Hebron. I saw that, and the humiliation of internationalists who were accompanying children to school. One young woman from England, from Lancashire, lovely woman of 23, told me that the previous day a group of settlers had attacked her and the small children that she was accompanying to school and kicked the legs from under her, from behind, kicked her knees so that she went down, and she showed me the bruises, and she was a young, innocent 23-year-old English person who had come with a good heart and was going home a very, very angry person. Now, you were in Jenin, you were in the refugee camp, so what did you see there?
Well, I was lucky because you wouldn't see any military. So Jenin is very north, and there's really no tourists there.
Right.
So you don't see the occupation, but as one of the young guys said to me, I know I can't go over there. You can't see it, but we know it's, you know, I can't go over there, you can, but I can't, you know. But so I wasn't working with young people, I was taking part in a workshop for cultural resistance in theatre. I was with internationals taking part as an intensive workshop. And the Freedom Theatre was set up in 2006 in the Jenin refugee camp. It was post the second Intifada and after the Battle of Jenin. And everyone was so tired after that. So they thought they had another theatre, Arna Marheme's The Stone Theatre. There's a documentary, Arna's Children, that you should really, really watch, and it explains how theatre came about in Jenin. But Giuliano set up the Freedom Theatre. But a lot of the people there, they're using theatre now as a weapon instead. They put down their guns, and theatre and culture they find more dangerous than any weapon.
Fabulous.
Yeah. Fabulous. And they put on shows, and there's a youth theatre, they use film, they use photography, poetry, dance, everything for male and female, and it's a fantastic centre.
Can I add something to that? One of the things that we were there in Bethlehem, Banksy, the international artist, I'm sure everybody knows Banksy, but he has done some pieces in Bethlehem. One of them that I recall, he's done a huge mural on the wall, just inside the big wall, the Israeli wall. He's done a huge mural, and it's a dove of peace, but the dove is wearing a flak jacket. It's really, really good piece, very good. But he has also created what he called, and just literally on the other side of the wall, he has created the walled off hotel play on the Waldorf. I mean, I'm sure some of you have been there, but it's a terrific place, and it really is clever, and it's an actual hotel. I don't know how many rooms, I think it's only about a dozen, but maybe less. But and it has a very nice bar and all this, but it's a whole kind of a send-up of the whole thing. He has a big monkey that's chained outside the main door as you go in. There's a chain on the monkey. And then when you go in, it's a very nice bar, but he also then has a complete kind of installation which shows how it all happened and how we are at the situation we're at now, with a very, very British voice, a kind of a Balfour Declaration type voice, describing, and this is what we did with these chaps, terribly nice chaps, but we thought they ought to be put in their place. And it's very good. But then he also has a place where he has laid out in kind of dinky form, little model cars, the weapons of oppression. One of the huge industries now, of course, that for Israel international is pacification technology. That's what they call it, pacification technology, and they've exported that, as you know, worldwide. But he has the weapons, what he would call the weapons of oppression, but they're the social weapons of oppression. So he has models of the big trucks that expel the tear gas and rubber bullets. Then he has a model of the bulldozers. I mean, it's a 2 to 3 story high bulldozer. And it just literally, as you can imagine what it does to a structure, particularly not a very strong one. And he has a model of that. And then he has a model of the skunk water machine, which is a machine that expels water at a crowd. And the smell is pretty ghastly, I believe, and it literally lasts for weeks and you can't get it for whatever. It's apparently really appalling. Yeah. And then there's another machine that he shows that is a sonic machine, which is a huge truck with some kind of a big speaker on it, and what it projects is a noise that is truly deafening, and it is apparently creates problems for a lot of people, particularly old people. But he has, these are all in another room, and then in the top story, or maybe it's not the top story, but he has an art gallery featuring some fantastic art paintings by Palestinian painters. Really, really good stuff. If ever you get there, be sure and go to the Walled Off Hotel. It's really just well worth a visit. But Nelly's right. The use of art, and we saw a lot of in some of the refugee camps, the kids are in there dancing, and beautiful kids, you know, beautifully dressed and all that. They're living in terrible conditions, but beautifully dressed and lovely performances, and they're really into the arts. It's really healthy.
And using art as resistance.
Yeah.
You know, so there's a 3-year theatre course that they do there, and the young people are taught not to leave and be famous actors, but to live in Janine and to make it better, you know, and to pass on the knowledge. And they're fabulous, and to be responsible citizens. And Giuliano, he was assassinated 6 years ago. So he's one to look up if anyone doesn't know about him. The Freedom Theatre, it's amazing. His mother was Israeli Jewish and his dad was a Palestinian Christian. But he would talk about the occupation of the mind, and don't let them occupy your mind, because if they occupy your mind, you've nothing left. And how the occupier's mind is more of a prison than the occupied. You know, they're living in more of a prison because it's full of hate. But, you know, which is great. It's fantastic. He's fantastic. So the Freedom Theatre was amazing, an amazing experience. Yeah, so.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, we saw that kind of everyday resistance on the cultural level as well. Some of you may be familiar with the Al Halal football club. The children from that club have been over visiting with us for the last couple of years. We formed that relationship in January 2013 when we visited the clubhouse there between the Jabalia and the beach camp, refugee camps in North Gaza, and the clubhouse with the windows still blown out from the war in November 2012, and it was impossible not to keep seeing what Mike was just talking about there, the field testing of Israeli weapons. You know, when Israel sells its weapons in the world, it can say they've been field tested.
That's right.
So we heard again and again about a drone. I don't know if you know that the story of Samson in the Bible takes place in Gaza. The temple that he pulls down is in Gaza. The drone that was being used again and again in Gaza is called Delilah. The Israelis call it Delilah. And Delilah can, and this was the way it's often used apparently, follow a young man on a motorbike going down a city street in Gaza. It can scan the number plate on his bike to see if they can identify him. If he turns around to look at it, they can run a facial recognition scan across his face, see if he's Mike Murphy, I guess. And the operator of that drone, who may very likely be a young woman in a trailer in the southern suburbs of Tel Aviv, can decide to detonate Delilah and to kill that young man and anyone else who might be close by. And we saw again and again the buildings that, the Israelis take great pride in their extraordinarily humanitarian capacity to destroy one building at a time. But the last building we saw, I remember, Max, the last building we saw was one, in addition to the great humanitarianism of just bringing down one building at a time, they would often telephone their victims. And this young man who lived in this particular building got the call during that 2012 war saying, your building is about to come down, you have 90 seconds to get your children out of there. He gathered up his family down the stairs, calling out to all his neighbors in this apartment block to come out. Sure enough, 90 seconds later, down came the block, and down came the one next to it as well, and a family of 5 killed in the neighboring block. And these stories, in November 2012 was one of the small wars of recent years, but those stories again and again. Important to say though, that I use the word war to describe these onslaughts, and I know a lot of people in the West don't like that, and for understandable reasons. We think of war as something more symmetrical than what we see in Gaza, but Palestinians in Gaza generally, they say war. They say war. And they say it sometimes with pride in the resistance that has been part of those wars, in the small pieces of resistance and of momentary victories that can sometimes be found there. And I don't think, I feel I have to respect that part of the Palestinian struggle as well, that struggle that says that they fight back.
Mm-hmm. And Harry, I know that the UN have said that Gaza is likely to be unlivable by 2020. I suppose that Gaza would be unlivable by 2020, according to the UN. And I just wondered, particularly with your conversations since 2013 and since the war, the onslaught in 2014 in particular, how are the people of Gaza and even the children that you talk to when they come over every year when you're organising the football, how do they feel now?
Gaza is unlivable. Gaza is unlivable already. It was unlivable when we were there. No one should have to live like that. That 2020 unlivable deadline was sort of an arbitrary number in a UN report published about 6 or 7 years ago, I think. It was kind of something has to be done because it's going to be unlivable by 2020. And there were a few kind of data points that pointed to that. In truth, it was unlivable then. It's unlivable now. It's intolerable. When we put the children back on the plane, it's impossible. It's impossible. Which is not to say it's the worst thing in the world. No one here is saying that these are the most suffering people in the world. This is a place where the wars only happen every 2 or 3 years. It's a place where the starvation is relative rather than absolute. It's a place where the United Nations and the NGOs basically are the real government and just about keep people alive. But it's not livable. It's not tolerable. And we know that it's solvable too, and we have the capacity and we have the tools to support the struggle of the people there. So even if it's not the worst in the world, it's absolutely intolerable, and we can do things to stop it.
Geographically, if you like, to probably the most famous place in Palestine for most of us here and for people throughout the world, and that is the city of Jerusalem. Now, I was there, and I have to say I found it, not being a Christian myself, not for a very long time, but to walk on the Via Dolorosa where Christ walked with the crown of thorns, to just see the militarization of it, the flags, the military everywhere, the remaining Palestinians locked in their remaining houses, and the place just overrun with new settlers who are constantly moving into Jerusalem, and making it, instead of the kind of spiritual holy site it should be for all religions and for the whole world, I just found it a really shocking thing to see the level of militarization of it. Do either of you want to comment about Jerusalem? Mike?
You are right, and what does strike you when you get in is the number of blue and white flags and stars and that are there, and it is, you can see that it is a veritable takeover. And yes, the houses are being taken over, and once they are, their flags are put up. One thing that is extremely prevalent is the street signage. The street signage now is Israeli, and it's and in Hebrew, a lot of it. And somebody pointed out to us, one of our guides pointed out to us, where the people are at the Wailing Wall, and then we were brought around to quite near it, and an Israeli sign pointed you into a smaller enclave, and the heading on it was the small Wailing Wall, and it is a part of the wall. And then in small Arabic underneath, we couldn't understand it, of course, but the guide who was bringing us in, he said, they've put up the small Wailing Wall. The Arabic underneath is the name of the family who own this little square with the wall, and they're a Palestinian family who, it's their square of land, their house adjoins it, and the wall is on their property. However, it has now been taken over by the Israelis as part of the Wailing Wall. And this is going on all over the place. Was it Sharon who bought the big house overlooking the Via Dolorosa? I think it was Sharon bought this huge house, literally overlooking the Via Dolorosa. So you've got Israeli flags all over the thing. So it is, we are taking over, and within another couple of years it'll be a complete takeover, I reckon.
Yeah, I didn't like it at all. It was a really funny vibe in the place. I didn't really like it. And in Bethlehem, I had a funny experience with a priest, because you kind of think, oh, we'll go in now and see where Jesus was born. And I was getting this powder stuff blessed, and I went up to him thinking, oh, lovely, like a nice Catholic priest, it'd be lovely. And I went up and I said, you get this? I said, get this blessed. Everyone was cute, and he goes, what's your sins? And I said, sorry? And he said, I said, I want to get this blessed. He goes, yeah, tell me your sins. I was going, I don't believe in sins. I said, I want to get it blessed. He goes, no, tell me. He said, no, you're very, very bad. You need to go to confession. And he sent me away. that was my experience with religion when I went there. So Jerusalem, wasn't into it. It was nice seeing the sights, but no, I didn't like the army, and it was just a completely different vibration,
Yeah,
So
it was. And the funny thing is as well that in Bethlehem, which should be, it's a Palestinian town, and it should be somewhere that the tourism that goes into the Holy Land should be really benefiting the people of Bethlehem. But in fact, most of the tours are organised from Israel. So what happens is that, and we met two Americans up at the Shepherd's Field, the very sound of it, the Shepherd's Field. But they told us that they were bussed in, told you'll go to the Church of the Nativity, the Shepherd's Field. Do not buy anything from the children, from anybody, any of the hawkers on the street. These are people who are in league with terrorism, and if you give them money, it goes straight back to causing security problems for Israel. These two Americans on a tourist bus were told this, and they were terrified of the Palestinians who were on the way into the Shepherd's Field, who were selling the little pictures of Jerusalem and the little pieces of handicraft, and they were terrified of them. They couldn't wait to get it back on the bus because they felt, well, we're just here for a few hours and we better be careful. And they were then afterwards being bussed to a shop in Tel Aviv to get all of the souvenirs of the Holy Land. So even to that extent, they squeeze, like what you were saying, Nelly, as well. The feeling of Jerusalem, I found it very sad. It made you angry. It's terrible that they can't leave anything for the Palestinians and just be, kind of live and let live, which would actually increase the possibility of their own security.
Mm-hmm.
Mike, Harry, you're on.
Just thinking about Jerusalem there, I've never been, and I probably never will be after this talk. But I did, in Gaza, meet an Israeli from Jerusalem, strangely enough. Because, as I said, the tunnels were working at the time, and through the tunnels, while we were visiting legitimately, as it were, as proper guests of an NGO and going through the crossing, through the tunnels had come Migo Peled. Some of you have made a familiar noise there. Migo Peled, who is lived most of his life in the United States, but from a very prominent Israeli family. His father, one of the hero generals of the '67 war, who became a peace activist later in his life, and Migo Peled, also an activist now, on behalf of the Palestinian people. He'd come through the tunnels. He was promoting a book. Imagine he was doing a book tour in Gaza, and he was meeting with a group of students in a seminar when I was traveling around with a journalist in Gaza, and we came upon him, and he told us the story that his mother always told of when they moved into their house in Jerusalem in 1948, and the coffee was still warm on the table from the Palestinian family that had just been thrown out of that house, and yet that was the house, that was the home, that was their home as a good Zionist family in Israel, in the new state of Israel, from that point onward. So I must say, of all the people we met and things we heard, and there were so many striking ones, go on, but Migo Peled and some of you have probably heard him speak here in Dublin or read his book, his tale from within, including his very firm conclusion that the only way that the world was going to get through
to Israel about the terrible, terrible crimes it was committing every day in the occupation and in the siege of Gaza was through boycott, divestment, and sanctions.
One of the, as you mentioned about Israelis, of course, it is assumed if you are anti-Israeli policy, you are anti-Semitic over there. And of course, it's almost juvenile to say such is not the case, that it's the policies and Zionism that people are anti rather than anything to do with Semitism. And in fact, a number of the ex-Israeli defense forces were guides for us. What is the group?
Breaking the silence.
Yeah, breaking the silence. And these are ex-soldiers, ex-Israeli soldiers, and there are a lot of people on the left in Israel who really are anti the policies that are being pursued by the Zionists. These people are held in, as you can imagine, the low esteem in which they're held in Israel, but they're extremely courageous. And we were brought, just an interesting anecdotal piece. One of these guys was guiding us. We're in a bus, so we're brought into this settlement. And again, the settlement very most attractive, as I mentioned earlier on. And he brought us down, he said, I want to show you something. And he brought us down to a graveyard, a cemetery. And just as an aside, I was in Vienna a couple of weeks ago, and the house where Oskar Schindler used to live, it has a plaque outside it, and the plaque is adorned on the top by white pebbles, so these are pebbles of approbation of people who are paying tribute to his memory, and they leave these pebbles on top. So this guy said, I want to show you something, and we all got off the bus, and he said, follow me, and we followed him around to the back of the cemetery, a good bit around into a field at the back of the cemetery, and there was a very big open space, and there were 4 lampposts with lights on top around, which I think some of them looked as if they were broken and they mightn't be functioning, but in the middle was a huge concrete coffin. That's all the best I can describe it, like a huge concrete coffin in the middle. Nothing written on it, but covered in white pebbles. And it was the tomb, unmarked, of the guy, was his name Goldstein? I can't remember. Oh, yeah. But the guy that went into the mosque and shot 20-something people 29. At prayer. Do you remember that?
In Hebron.
What was it? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, Goldstein. Okay, well, that was one thing. But again, it was a lot of the pebbles on top, and they just say, well, okay, there are a lot of people who think he's a hero and that, but boy, it was an interesting illustration of something, and I thought the guy was very brave to bring us around and to show it to us. So there are a lot of Israelis who really disapprove of what's going on, the government policies being followed. And you just hope that more and more of them are listened to.
Good point. I'm going to open it up very shortly to the audience for questions. Just one thing on the good Israelis. There's a group called Bethlehem, which is an Israeli-based human rights organisation. They've done an awful lot of work on children. And they work with another organisation of human rights lawyers about children being arrested in the middle of the night and what happens to them. They're arrested and they are taken without the presence of their parents or without lawyers, and they are often blindfolded, taken in the middle of the night, taken into custody and roughed up and treated very badly, shouted at and roughed up. And very often, even most of them, protesting their innocence, because the only thing they're being accused of is throwing pebbles, throwing stones. What they are talking about is that they will admit or sign confessions, because it's the only way they can get back home or see their parents. The parents are not allowed with them, and it's only when they sign a confession to throwing stones, that they'll be allowed out or be allowed to see a lawyer. The length of time as well that the children are being held in detention, it's absolutely shocking. We're talking about all of these children being under 17, and it's a rate of about 700 a year. Mm-hmm. Did anyone come across children in duress? You mentioned it a bit, Mike, about
in
the
duress, no.
in the.
Well, you mean, yeah, I was at one of the refugee camps. We were in looking at some children doing some dancing and performing and that. And in the meantime, there were some young guys, teenagers outside, and there was a barracks, an Israeli barracks just up at the top of a hill. And the young fellas were out there, and they were throwing stones at the soldiers. And some of the soldiers were outside on the hill looking down, threatening, running down at them, and the kids had run away. But they were firing stones at them, and the stones, of course, weren't landing. I mean, the kids weren't going to get within rifle range, you know. And the stones were landing way up. But anyway, I stood like a half-wit in the doorway, looking at this, and all of a sudden, the gates of the barracks opened up, and this big truck came barreling out and down, and the soldiers came running along beside it with their guns at the ready, and they came barreling down the hill, firing tear gas. And now suddenly the whole place, the smoke, and mind you, it went past me, the thing, and the tear gas landed kind of at the back of the hole there, and I thought, but God, all of a sudden it got me. Now the kids had scarves, put them over their faces and all that, but myself and another guy were standing there, and boy, it gets you in the eyes, and it got suddenly your eyes, your eyes are gone, you're crying, and a headache. You get an unbelievable headache all of a sudden with it, and I wasn't even in the middle of it, you know. But the kids then dispersed, but these boys came at them, and wow, it was scary, you know. The kids retreated into the refugee camp, and they stopped at the edge of the refugee camp. But it's apparently a daily occurrence. I think it's entertainment for the kids, really. But I think it really is. But it was pretty impressive to see what did happen. And there's no mercy, I can assure you. And one of the guys said, usually it's rubber bullets as well, and the rubber bullets can hurt, you know.
I would say that the Palestinians, I've never seen so many, they're exhausted. They're so tired, Palestinian people, and you can just see it on their face. When we were there was a photographic exhibition because it was the anniversary of the invasion of Jenin refugee camp, where a lot of it was demolished. And I'd like to read you a quote from underneath one of the photographs, because it kind of sums up the heart of them, of the people. They're amazing. They really teach you how to live, you know. The elderly passed away and gave the keys of their homes to the young. The young grow up and never forget. It becomes part of their genes to love life as much as they can. Their eyes are watching tomorrow and their feet are walking forward. With their brush they write the history on the walls of their schools and homes, that on this earth is a life worth living. I thought that was lovely.
Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you to our wonderful panel for those heartfelt contributions and intellectually well-made contributions as well. I would reiterate what panel have said about the issue of boycott. It's something that we can do very simply in our own daily lives. Look out for the avocados in Lidl is my advice. Throw them behind the fixtures if you can't get satisfaction from the supermarket manager. And the truth is, because we stayed, when I was out there, we stayed with a Palestinian family. They were so aware of the Irish-Palestinian Solidarity Campaign. It was unbelievable. This family, sitting in a room in Bet Sahur with their children, were showing images from the website of the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign in Ireland. And they were so aware of that there was a picket that day, and there were 60 people on it. And they were seeing that near Bethlehem in the West Bank. So, you know, every little contribution we can make, it's worthwhile doing it. And people have made some very worthwhile suggestions here tonight. So go out, be active on what you've heard tonight, and do whatever you can, small or big. Thank you very much for listening.